to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians discuss depictions of Amish and Mennonites in popular culture. This week, we will be discussing A Sister's Wish by Shelley Shepherd Gray. Content warning. This book and our discussion around it mentions child abuse in a non-graphic manner. But before we get into the story, here is what Gray has to say about why she writes about Amish people. I started writing about the Amish because their way of life appealed to me. I wanted to write stories about regular, likable people in extraordinary situations who just happen to be Amish. Before we get into this book, I want to have a little chit chat with our co-hosts. And so the opening of this book focuses on a rather bizarre set of injuries that befalls our main character, where she is bitten by a snake and then immediately kicked by a goat so badly that she breaks her leg. So that seemed a good segue into talking about interesting injuries. So Erin, why don't you start?
The injury that immediately came to mind is when I was 8 or 9, and we were living in Iowa, and my parents forced me to go to Sunday night church, which was never something I wanted to do when I was 8 or 9 years old. But to entertain ourselves, all of us, 9-year-olds, after whatever church service we had to go to, we entertained ourselves by jumping off the steps. So there was this large staircase going into the sanctuary, probably 12 or 13 steps. And the game was whoever jumped from the highest step won. And so I was doing really great. And right when my parents were like, Erin, it's time to go, and they were going to drag me out the door, I was like, one more. And so I jumped from the highest step of all the other kids. I was definitely going to win. And I landed and rolled my ankle really weird. And my parents were so mad at me for not coming when they immediately called, that they didn't think, they thought I was faking it. I didn't get to see the doctor until the next day, when I had it wasn't broken. I had a 3rd degree sprain, and I was on crutches for 2 or 3 weeks. It was pretty terrible. But yeah, so it did happen in a Mennonite church. So I guess a good tie-in to our topic.
How about you, Tilly?
There are a few different options. One of the things I first thought when reading this book was, oh, finally, they're representing the dangers of farm life in a more realistic way. Because I grew up with a lot of trepidation living on a farm. I was told, don't go near the auger, it could cut off your leg. And don't ever climb in a grain bin alone, you could smother yourself and die. And if you're on someone else's farm, don't go near any manure pits, because they could smother you and you could die. And don't go near a tractor on your own, because it could flip over and you could die. But I'm alive. I made it and didn't break any bones. And weirdly, I think the most I've been injured in the course of working on the farm was when I was painting a barn roof with some reflective paint. It was time to re-silver the roof of the barn to make it more reflective and keep the barn cooler. And it was this nasty fibrous oil paint, and you literally applied it with a broom. And I had been using sunscreen, but I didn't use enough. And because I was standing on a flat surface that was basically a mirror, my legs got roasted, a really bad burn, lobster red. And my dad called me Tandoori Tilly for a week because I looked rather like I had come out of a tandoori oven. That was I think the worst farm related injury I've had.
Wow. Those are both really great. All right, well, let's get into the story. So A Sister's Wish is the 3rd book, Gray's Charmed Amish Life series. This is, so far, it seems to be a bit of a habit of ours, in that we like to pick books midway through a series to read for this podcast. So the first 2 books in a series are about the older 2 siblings, the Kinsinger siblings. Or the first 2 were about Lucas and Rebecca, while A Sister's Wish deals with their younger sister, Amelia. Amelia wants to date the hunky best friend of Lucas, but Simon's tattoos, time in prison, and troubled childhood are too much for Lucas and Rebecca, who feel the need to control 22-year-old Amelia's life. Will Simon's desire for beautiful, blonde, delicate Amelia overcome his crappy self-esteem and residual trauma from the abuse his Amish parents dealt out to him and his siblings? Will both of Simon's siblings randomly return to charm, all better and healthy and interested in restoring their relationship? Will Amelia grow a spine and tell her siblings to back off? Will Amelia remain surprisingly devoted to a goat that breaks her leg? Will the missing Kissinger siblings return at long last in time to key up the fourth book in the series? Well, I don't want to spoil anything, but yes to all of those things. That's my brief summary of this book.
Very good.
So the first question I wanted to dive into a little bit is, this book dealt with some pretty legitimately dark themes of child abuse. I feel like a number of these other books have kind of hinted at dark pasts, but in this one, Simon is very unfortunately the victim of some pretty horrendous abuse. So the book also deals with the silence of the Amish the community in regards to it, and the way this abuse impacts several of the characters. How did you feel about how the book handled trauma, its impact not only on the children who experience it, but the community that condones it? So I thought I would start with you, Tilly.
I had some mixed feelings. For the most part, I came down on the side of being grateful that the book depicted it at all. The previous books that we have read have been much rosier pictures about the Amish way of life, as if the greatest inconvenience one could have while being Amish was like not having a cell phone to, look up someone's address. When the reality is much more complicated, and the Amish are in fact people like any people, and that in a closely knit community, things like sexual abuse and child abuse do happen. I also appreciated that while it was significant, it wasn't necessarily depicted. There wasn't a real need to be like, oh, look at poor Simon's miserable childhood. They sort of mentioned him running away, and they mentioned that he had a hard life, and you could see the effects that it had on his behavior in the present. The reason I felt conflicted about the presence of abuse is that there wasn't enough resolution for me, which I suppose is realistic. Not everyone who's abused gets a resolution where the parents who are abusive get called to the front of a church and chastised and repent. But I would have liked to see that. I wanted the community to do what the Amish community is fully capable of doing, and actually, do a public confession and have a reckoning with the wider community about what behavior is and is not acceptable. Because they can do that when it comes to bonnet strings or having rubber tires on tractors. And the fact that it didn't happen with abuse is perhaps not unrealistic, but sad.
Those are some really good points. Yeah. And just to give a little bit of background here, the parents of Simon are both, you don't really mention them, but it's clear they live in the same community and they appear to have no repercussions. What about you, Erin?
The first thing I want to say is just that child abuse, at least in terms of physical abuse, is pretty rare in the Amish community, and that is for most families and most communities. The tenet of nonviolence that Amish adhere to would extend to child discipline. So there might be other forms of abuse, but physical abuse would be pretty rare. And I just think it's important to state that pretty clearly. But I also did want to touch on sort of mental health more generally. And this is an area where, again, things will vary extremely between different communities. But generally, the Amish have made great strides in this area in the past 30 or 40 years. Oak Lawn, which is a community mental health facility in Goshen, now has an Amish wing. So that's just one sign that getting treatment for mental health issues is now more acceptable. When it comes to children, or probably really any mental health issue, because they're an insular community, they do often try to deal with things within the community first. And that's not necessarily bad, but it can mean that, in particular with children, if there's a trauma that a kid is dealing with, they might not get help before that trauma is a bit set in. So yeah, those are the comments I wanted to add.
The only thing I would add, the author didn't entirely know what to do with residual trauma. Simon has 3 siblings, of which we get to know one who has left the Amish, but seems to have worked very hard to recover from certain aspects of her traumatic childhood. But there was an element, this kind of push-pull of kind of wanting it to haunt the characters, but also wanting them to get over it / have somehow have projects that would somehow free them from their past. Simon gets this idea of starting a youth center, and it's clear the author is putting that out there as this, like, this is going to solve Simon's trauma problems, which is maybe not a realistic way to deal with it. And also in both of the stories, I felt like, at least especially with Simon, there wasn't a lot of nuance into how Simon shifted so thoroughly, and not only getting over this trauma that, you know, led him to run away, which led him to drugs and eventually to prison, but then to make a rather shocking U-turn and come the whole way back to the Amish church and decide to join. That was just kind of explained matter-of-factly, and that felt a little bit, there could be some really interesting things to talk about there, but I didn't feel like the author really fully delved into that. All right, so the second question is, so this book gave us 2 scintillating, and the extreme quotations there, by inspirational romance Christian standards, or IRCs. One involving a bare-chested tattoo-covered Simon, and the other Amelia's rather strong reaction to their first kiss. Any thoughts on the way that sexuality is or isn't depicted in this book? Let's start with Erin.
I have a lot to say. I apologize in advance. I feel like I've narrowed it down to like 3 or 4 points I want to make, but there's just so much happening in this book. I'll start with the positive. First, it was kind of nice to read a book that wasn't quite as chaste. Amelia in particular had sexual desires, and she kind of shared that. And we haven't really seen that in any of the other books we've read, at least not so clearly. But my problems. One was the cover, and I realized that podcasting is not a visual medium, so we will post the picture on the Instagram if you want to look at it. But the man is sort of grasping the woman, who's, I guess, Amelia, presumably, like at the waist, like it just in a very longing sort of pose that I don't think any young Amish couple would be caught dead posing in. That would be just a little too sexual for the Amish. And then you didn't mention this in your question, but there's this sort of theme throughout the book that like Simon and Amelia have kind of always loved each other, which is cute in theory, but Amelia was 9 at the start of this book and Simon was 16. And, you know, they don't start dating until their 20s. And I don't really have a problem with the age difference, other than like there's some comments about what a beautiful 9-year-old she was and her beautiful, delicate features, even as a child, that I don't know. I mentioned this in our text conversation. It reminded me a little of Twilight and like Jacob imprinting on the baby and like just kind of how weird and creepy that feels. And my third problem isn't really a problem. It's so the makeout scene. It happens in a horse and buggy, and it's described as very sensual, but I had to laugh. So my first kiss happened on a hayride in 8th grade. And I bring this up because if you're in a buggy, you're sitting side by side, sort of like when you're on a hayride. And let me tell you that kissing someone when you're sitting side by side, especially when it's your first kiss and you have no idea what you're doing, it's really not that good of an experience. Sorry to my 8th grade boyfriend if you're listening to this. So like her reaction to it just struck me. I mean, she had been in love with this guy forever, so it may have been different for her, but like for me, I was just like, oh, wait till you're like standing up. It'll be a lot better. Anyway, so those were my thoughts on the sexuality in the book.
How about you, Tilly?
I'd say pretty similar. views as to Aaron's.
Was your first kiss on a hayride too?
No, but I've kissed in cars and it's not been particularly easy. Yeah. So, I can imagine that a bouncier, smellier version of a car wouldn't really set the mood. I liked that sexuality was a little bit more present. It was by no means explicit, and you didn't see any sex happening. They were well-behaved Amish people. They pretty much put their arms around each other and sat next to each other and went on picnics. But as they did those things, there was still a sense that they wanted to go farther, and they were invested in a relationship that would end up in sex. So they weren't sexless, which is one thing that I think some of the other novels we've read have been borderline in that vein. And one thing I really appreciated is actually the lack of something, which is they did not equate God with romance or romance with God. I have a lot of feelings about music or theology that talks about personal relationships to Jesus as if Jesus was your boyfriend. And some of the other books we have read have done a lot of stuff. Like, I think there was even one that basically ended on the note that was like, and she loved him more than anyone except for God. Hopefully you love God in a different way than you love your partner. Christian inspirational romance can blur the two, which I don't perceive as particularly healthy. So I was relieved that they seemed to be open with each other and progressing at a rate that was happy for them, with a goal that was happy for them, that just didn't involve Jesus in the bedroom.
Well, that segues really nicely into our next question. So I'm actually going to switch the order and of this. How would you describe how the book approached religion? And was it different from other Amish romance books that we have read? So actually, I want to go to you, Tilly, since you already kind of made that transition into talking about the role of Jesus as your boyfriend. So I don't know if you want to either expand on that or if there are other aspects of the religion in this book that you would like to mention.
I have some mixed feelings about the presentation of religion. I think this book, in comparison to others, was much less concerned with presenting the religious aspects of Amish life. It mentioned church. Characters thought about God's plan for them. Characters prayed. But it wasn't this constant narration of God wants me to do this, or I feel called to be with this person because of God. And I thought that's more realistic to my own religious experience. I don't think about God every minute of the day in my mundane tasks. So I thought it felt more realistic.
Anything to that you want to add in that vein, Aaron?
Yeah, the only thing I jotted down is just sort of, and Tilly sort of hinted at this already, but yeah, it just felt way less evangelical than the other books. Like, and I wonder if that's because there weren't as many English characters. Really the only outsiders that they interact with are the siblings who would already be familiar with Amish life. And so that was my hypothesis as to why there was less of that, like, overt evangelicalism that we've seen in some of the other books. I also thought it approached the topic of forgiveness in a really kind of interesting way, I would say. So there was Simon coming back to the church after his Rumspringa and joining, but yet, even though technically anything he would have done during that period should have not really counted, clearly the siblings had problems with their relationship. So that whole nuanced, okay, well, we can forgive, but do we forget? Are you good enough for our sister? Felt very realistic, actually. And similarly, when, is the sister's name Tessa? When she ran into the bishop and was like, yeah, I forgive you, but why didn't you intervene when we were being abused? So I actually kind of thought it dealt with those issues in a good way.
Were you angry that the bishop did not apologize for failing them? He gave his excuses, which were some more understandable than not, but he did not once apologize. or say
Okay.
that there was
Now I'm
failure
angry.
or that there was a need for justice. And that does ring a little too true, because in the elevation of forgiveness in the Mennonite and Amish traditions, there is a corresponding problem with accountability and justice for victims.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk about that for a long time. But this made me think of it. I thought, this is not a system where resolution happens. This is a system where you deal with a problem because you have a higher goal. So that's realistic, but it also makes me so angry.
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely remembered that scene too. So just to explain, so Tessa is the sister of Simon, who was also, so she was also abused, but she kind of passes through charm, but she is not Amish anymore. And she runs into the Amish bishop, who would have been in charge of disciplining, or would have been the one to potentially call out her parents. And it was a very puzzling interaction to me. First of all, yeah, she was less angry with him than I would have been, maybe. And the thing that kind of puzzled me is that while he's kind of given this air of humble wisdom that a lot of Amish bishops get, but he also seems like he just doesn't really see his role as one to even, like, that he, in some ways, he doesn't apologize because he doesn't necessarily see that he did anything wrong to a certain act. Like, what came across to me was he was just kind of like, it's so bad that you got abused, I'm sorry. Not, I should have taken action, or as a community leader, I'm partially responsible, or anything, which I was kind of puzzled by. And honestly, I don't really have a lot of knowledge to speak on about that. I would just say, in some ways, while there are many benefits to lay leadership, it makes it harder for accountability and stuff like that to take place. Mm-hmm. Any obviously that kind of turned into a big red flag, but any red flags in this book, or things that bothered you that maybe they didn't get quite right? Tilly, what did you think?
I thought there were only a couple spots where things jarred me. There was one time when Amelia is laid up with her cast and she is tired of playing hearts, so she goes off to like skulk in a corner. And I thought, they're playing hearts, they're using face cards.
I totally missed
what
that.
Respectable Amish family would play with face cards? Because if any of our listeners don't know, face cards are too easy to gamble with. There are other games, often sort of family-friendly ones you would see, at your regular stores, Skip-Bo and Yahtzee and that sort of thing. So but that was a small thing. I figured, and probably it's the kind of thing that you could get away with in an Amish family. Just like, well, we just won't gamble. That was the only thing that really stood out to me. I thought the names were better in this. The peripheral names were better. Like there was a Roman and an Atlee, and like the kind of the weird names that stick around in Amish communities.
How about you, Erin?
Yeah, my main one happened right before the makeout scene. But Simon picks her up in what he calls a courting buggy, which is apparently a buggy without a top, which, first of all, I never knew that those were called courting buggies, and I don't think they actually are, but more on that in a minute. But then later, a couple paragraphs later, there's a line, "It's a good thing he doesn't live in Indiana then. Most of the orders there only have topless buggies," which all of us on this podcast right now live in Indiana, and that is just not true. First of all, the weather would just not be great for topless buggies, but they're just, I actually consulted, if any of our listeners want to learn more about the Amish, a good book is The Riddle of Amish Culture, which I happen to have on my shelf because I was a history major at a Mennonite college. But yeah, there's the open buggy, sometimes erroneously called the courting buggy, is used by young and old alike, but its use has declined in recent years. So there is no such thing as the courting buggy. It's just an open-aired buggy. Some Amish have them, some don't. It's certainly not more prevalent in Indiana than anywhere else. And I guess someone could fact check me, but I'm pretty sure there would not be any Amish ordnungs or communities that would only have topless buggies. So minor detail, but I was sort of like, what? That's a weird thing to try and assert.
I just realized they probably call it a courting buggy because it doesn't have a top, so you can't make out in it very well.
Oh, that is a good point.
We already talked about the difficulties of making out in buggies / cars, but if you don't have a top and everyone can see you, that would definitely add some community pressure to keep that courting at a very tasteful level.
There's
completely made up by me. I don't know if that's actually factual, but it was just an idea.
That seems accurate. She also comments on the horse and how fancy it is and that it's a Palomino. And again, I don't know enough about Amish horses to know, but I do know that anecdotally, my ancestors left the Amish church because the bishop told them their horses were too fancy. So I'm not sure that would also be an accurate thing you'd probably comment on how strong they are or, how frugal or what a great deal you got on the horse, but you probably wouldn't call it fancy.
So I think that leads us to kind of wrapping up. So I'm interested to know final thoughts. And also we always like to have a scale. So we're going to give this out of 5 rippling tattooed back muscles. How many of those rippling tattooed back muscles would you give this book? So let's start with you, Erin.
This book felt more realistic and practical than some of our other books. It dealt with harder issues. It's probably because we chose book 3 in a series, but the plot ended like very abruptly. Like all of a sudden the book was over and you're like, oh, it's done now. I would give it maybe 4 rippling back tattoos.
How about you, Tilly?
I agree. I think this stands out above some of our previous ones. I think that the writing style was good. The plot was not very hilly, if that makes sense. There was a lot of like, we have a problem, you're not good enough for my sister. And then it would be resolved in the next chapter. And then there'd be like a slightly different issue. So it was very mundane real life problems. Some of which made me want to shake mostly the male characters and go, women have agency. But they usually figured it out that women had agency by the next chapter, which was great. It was a total turnaround. And so, they weren't fighting off English scammers trying to steal their camel farm. In terms of characterization and writing and plot, this one would probably get 3 or probably 4 rippling back muscles, except for it's still not quite my cup of tea, so it might end up as a 3 just because I'm biased.
Yeah, I think my rating would line up pretty much perfectly with yours. I think, and I do want to say I may have come across a little tongue-in-cheek, but I did feel like the writing was a little better with this book, and in some ways, because the author attempted to deal with kind of some deeper, more realistic issues, there was actually more things to discuss about this book that felt real. Yeah, there were some minor things, but there definitely were fewer of the kind of both the glaring errors in depiction of Amish, and there was also a little less of the forced Amishness, like throwing in random Pennsylvania Dutch words and really like trying to emphasize like, did you guys get it that this is about the Amish? I'm writing about the Amish. They're my friends. There was a little less of that in this book, which I'm always a fan of. So,
did you notice, either of you, that this was our first book to include a Amish recipe at the end? They tend to often include just really random things like a recipe or a picture of an Amish quilt for no reason, just at the very end. So I did chuckle at our first encounter with the recipe. It's monster cookies from the Country Blessings Cookbook by Clara Koblenz.
Oh. This book also had a different first that I made a note of. I forgot to mention earlier. This is the first book we have read to use the term worldly. Oh. And I thought she might get the 4-star rating or the 4 rippling pack rating just for that use of worldly alone, because that is the term to cause shame in an Amish or Old Order Mennonite person, because you are not supposed to be of the world. You are supposed to be removed from the world. So in this case, someone is too worldly to date Amelia, and that's a big no-no. And I laughed at that.
Well, that concludes this week's discussion of A Sister's Wish by Shelley Shepherd Gray. But before we wrap up the episode, we have a special treat from Tilly and Aaron.
We are back this week with some more Most Mennonite Moments, which I think we should maybe call our but I'm not sure how Tilly and Abby feel about that. But first we have Deanna on Twitter, who remembered to put chili in the crock pot before work. And what I think is particularly Mennonite about this is that she included tomatoes from her garden that were in her freezer.
We also have Rebecca, who will be an upcoming guest on this podcast shortly. She has a slightly different take. She says that her secret Mennonite thrill is a guilty pleasure of using saran wrap when it's not particularly necessary and then throwing it away, which I can get behind, because my family had to sort of encourage my grandmother to not use saran wrap very often and to stop washing it, hanging it out to dry, and reusing it until it lost all of its cling. She's a little bit more into tinfoil now. This is also a grandmother who, I mean, she exists at the intersection of Mennonite and Depression baby. So she saves her breadcrumbs. If she slices bread, she'll literally scoop the breadcrumbs into a little plastic container and then put it in her freezer until the breadcrumb container is full enough that she can add like a tablespoon of breadcrumbs to her casserole. She does a lot, but most of it I think of as somewhat normal, like saving your margarine containers until they die and wiping down your parchment paper so you can use it a second time in baking, or a third or fourth or fifth or 10th.
We also heard this week from Marie, who gave us some advice on what to do with old shoelaces. So here you go, Tilly. What you can do is take up sewing and mask making in particular and use the old shoelaces that you've saved as extra elastic. So that's what Marie did at the beginning of the pandemic when she wanted to make masks, but there wasn't enough elastic for sale. So she used old shoelaces. So thanks, Marie, for sharing that tip with us.
That's a good one. I did make several masks at the beginning of the pandemic, and some of them have elastic that I had on hand, and some of them have been put together with ribbon or lace as their tying implements. So maybe I'll go through the lace ones and upgrade them to shoelace.
I didn't realize you already knew how to sew.
I like it, but I am not particularly good. I definitely don't go anywhere near clothing, and I have a hard time doing anything other than straight lines. So anyhow, please feel free to contact us with your secret guilty pleasures and your most Mennonite moments, maybe your most memorable Mennonite moments. I don't know how many M sounds we can get into this, but I think we should keep trying.
So are you on board with mms?
Maybe. I'll have to live with that one for a while and see what I think.
Thanks for that great roundup, Aaron and Tilly. And as they said, we always love to hear from you. You can email us at plainwrongpod@gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at plainwrongpod. Join us next week. We will be tackling the big movie that we've heard from you all that we should be addressing, The Witness. So you can look forward to that and all its delicious Harrison Ford goodness. But before we end, I do want to say a big thank you to my friend Miriam, who when she heard that we were looking for ways to get good outro music, put her musical prowess to the test and created this music for us. So thank you, Miriam, and enjoy.